They always told me my father walked out on us one winter night, leaving nothing behind but silence and a broken front door latch. But yesterday, while clearing the back field, my shovel struck something soft beneath the soil, the faded wool of my father's old coat. And tucked inside its inner pocket was a note written in a child's unsteady handwriting, one I recognized as my own. I grew up on a small, wind-bruised patch of land just outside our town, a place where stories settled like fog, and memories clung to the fields long after people were gone. My father disappeared when I was 8, and my mother never spoke of him except with a tired sadness. Now, years later, I've returned to fix up the land after my mother's passing. I came looking for closure. Instead, I found a coat buried in the soil, carrying a secret that pulls me back into a childhood I barely remember. Dusk had a way of settling over the field like a tired hand, slow, familiar, heavy. I remember standing there with the shovel, listening to the insects quiet down one by one, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The grass brushed against my legs, brittle from neglect, and every step felt like walking through someone else's memory. I told myself I was only clearing old land. Just soil. Just roots. Nothing more. But the ground beneath my boots, it felt soft. Too soft. Like it had been touched recently, even though no one had walked this field in years. I'd been back on the property for 3 days, long enough to remember which floorboards creaked, but not long enough to feel at home. The house still smelled like dust and lavender, the way my mother kept it. And the field behind it, well, that part never felt like mine. My father used to walk it at sunrise when I was a child, hands in his pockets, head tilted like he was listening to something only he could hear. I thought of him now, while the last of the sun slipped behind the hills. Thought of the way his coat hung by the back door every winter, heavy and smelling of cedar. Thought of how one day he stepped outside wearing it, and never came back. People in town said he left. People in town always talked like they knew things. I pushed the shovel into the earth and felt it sink deeper than expected. The soil gave way too easily, like it hadn't settled in years. There was a thin line of weeds missing in one straight path, a subtle dip that didn't fit the rest of the field. The wind came through then, nudging the tall grass to the side. I don't know why, but it made me shiver. Like the field was showing me something on purpose. I stabbed the shovel down again. This time it hit something soft, softer than dirt, softer than roots. A muffled sound, almost like fabric catching the blade. For a second, I froze. The evening light had turned the ground into long ribbons of shadow, and my breath felt loud, too loud, in the open air. I knelt and brushed aside the loose soil. A dark shape surfaced beneath the dirt, the corner of something folded or crumpled. At first glance, it looked like an old blanket some animal had dragged around. The field got its fair share of strays, foxes, neighbors' dogs, things that shouldn't be out here but always found their way. I reached down and pulled at the edge of the cloth. It resisted at first, like it didn't want to be moved. Then it gave way. A wave of dirt spilled off the fabric, revealing a thick collar, worn edges, and a button I hadn't seen in over 20 years. My throat closed. The world seemed to tilt just a little, enough to make my balance waver. It was a coat. Not just any coat, his coat. The wool was still intact, dark and stubborn, the way he liked things. For a moment, all I could do was stare at it, my hands coated in dust, my mind filling with the smell of cedar and winter nights. A part of me whispered that this wasn't real. But the coat didn't care. It simply lay there, waiting. I sat back on my heels and let the breath leave my lungs slowly, as if the field was pulling it out of me. My father's coat. Buried in our own land. The place where he used to stand at sunrise. My fingers brushed over the fabric again. It was damp with soil, but underneath, the weight, the stitching, it was unmistakable. A ghost from my childhood, dug up by accident. A memory flickered, weak like a dying match. I was small, sitting by the kitchen table. My father walked past the window, his coat brushing the glass when he leaned close to latch the shutters. He looked worried. Or maybe tired. At that age, I couldn't tell the difference. The memory slipped away before I could hold it. Like so many memories of him do. I tried to imagine how long the coat had been here. Who dug the hole? Who covered it? Why it was hidden at all? But every question I formed seemed to float out into the dusk and vanish before it reached the air. The field felt different now, not just overgrown, but expectant. Like it remembered something I didn't. I touched the fabric again and felt a chill run through me. It wasn't the cold. It was recognition. And the feeling that something was missing, something that used to be inside that coat. The sky dimmed into a soft bruise of purple as I gathered the coat in my hands. It sagged with the weight of damp soil, but there was something else, something heavier, sitting at the bottom of my chest. I stood there for a long time, listening to the distant hum of the road and the soft settling of the earth around me. If someone had buried this coat, someone had touched this ground after he disappeared. A small tremor ran through the soil beneath my feet, or maybe it was just my imagination. Either way, I felt it, a quiet pull, urging me deeper into a story I hadn't asked to remember. I looked down at the coat, at the dark wool clinging to the fading light. And a single question rose in the silence. Why was this here, and what else did this field try to keep hidden from me? The coat lay on the kitchen table like it was waiting for something. The dirt had dried into thin lines across the wool, settling into the seams the same way years settle into a person, quiet, unnoticed, heavy. I stood there with the window cracked open, letting in a thin breath of cold evening air. The house didn't make a sound. Not even the refrigerator dared to hum. There was a moment, small, almost forgettable, where I thought about folding the coat back up and leaving it outside, letting the rain take whatever story it held. But something in me couldn't walk away. Something knew the field hadn't given it back without reason. I hadn't touched anything of my father's in years. Most of his belongings disappeared slowly after he did, a missing hat here, an old pair of boots sold at a yard sale, the smell of cedar fading from the hall closet. My mother always kept the house tidy, almost too tidy, as if order could keep the past from spilling into the present. But this coat, it carried the past like a weight. I pulled a chair up and sat down. The table felt cold beneath my arms. The kind of cold that slips into your bones without asking permission. The coat was heavier than I remembered. The lining stiff. The pockets sewn deep. I slid my hand inside the inner pocket, expecting nothing more than dust or a broken zipper. Instead, my fingers brushed something thin, paper, folded small, and no bigger than a matchbox note. I pinched it gently and pulled. It came out reluctantly, edges curled and stained a dull brown from the soil. The paper trembled between my fingers, though I wasn't sure if it was the paper shaking or my hand. For a long moment, I just stared at it. Something inside me, a child, maybe, whispered that I already knew what it was. But the adult in me shook that voice away, telling me stories don't come back after 20 years. Still, I opened it. The handwriting hit me first. Round letters. Slanted lines. The kind of uneven strokes only a child makes when the pencil is too big for their hand. My hand. I didn't need to compare it to old notebooks or homework sheets. I knew it like I knew the shape of my own breath. For words sat on the page. Simple. Crooked. Spaced out like I'd been afraid of pressing too hard. Don't tell Mama. I saw him. The room grew smaller. The air thinned. Outside, the wind brushed against the windowpane, soft but insistent, like someone tapping to be let in. I placed the torn note beside the photographs, watching the two halves of my childhood sit together for the first time in decades. One written by my small shaking hand. The other preserved by hers. The house felt different now, heavier, or maybe just more honest. Outside, the wind brushed against the siding, a long, low sound that made the curtains stir like someone passing through the room. I rose slowly, the photos held gently in my palm, and looked around my mother's quiet world. Everything she left behind felt deliberate. Chosen. Protected. But this secret she kept tucked away behind lock and dust. I whispered into the dim air, barely trusting my own voice. What were you trying to keep me from remembering, Mama? The kettle hadn't started its soft rattling yet, but the house already felt awake, like it knew I was trying to remember something it didn't want me to. I sat at the kitchen table with the torn note beside me, its edges curling like it was shrinking from the light. The coat lay draped over the back of the nearest chair, heavy, patient, watching. Outside, the sky was turning the color of cold iron. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then stopped abruptly, as if remembering it shouldn't disturb the quiet of this house. I folded my hands together, breathed slowly, and tried to step back into a winter night I had spent my whole life avoiding. The kitchen hadn't changed since the night my father disappeared. Same peeling paint along the windowsill. Same humming light above the sink, flickering whenever the temperature dropped too quickly. Even the chair beneath me creaked in the same familiar way, a sound that used to mean bedtime was near. I traced the rim of my coffee mug, letting the heat seep into my palms. Memories don't come when called. They come like fog, drifting, soft, sometimes cold enough to sting. The winter he vanished was supposed to be an ordinary one. A season of frost on windows, muddy boots by the door, my mother humming quietly as she stirred pots on the stove. But something happened that changed all of that. Something I must have seen through the eyes of an 8-year-old child who wasn't ready to understand. Something that left me clutching a notebook close to my chest, like it was the only thing keeping me from disappearing too. I tried to picture myself then. Small hands. Thin pajamas. Standing by the door when the world outside felt unfriendly. But the details slipped in and out of focus. Like someone had erased sections of the memory and left only the faint outlines behind. Still, something waited in the dark edges of my mind, patient as winter itself. The kettle finally whistled, a low, trembling sound that startled me more than it should have. I let it whistle until it faded into silence again, then leaned back in my chair, eyes half closed, trying to let my thoughts drift. And that's when the first image formed. Not clear. Not sharp. Just a single moment, a shout outside, muffled by snow and distance. Not my father's voice. Someone else's. A tone I couldn't name, but one that tightened something inside my young chest. I saw myself standing near this very table, small fingers gripping the edge as cold air rushed in from the front door. The curtains moved. The floor shuddered with a gust of freezing wind. And beyond the doorway, a silhouette. Tall. Still. More shadow than man. I leaned closer to the memory, but the image flickered like an old film reel losing frames. Next came the detail that hit hardest, the notebook pressed against my chest. My little notebook. The one with frayed corners and childish drawings. The same notebook the torn page must have come from. Why was I holding it that tightly? Why did I think I needed it? I exhaled slowly, feeling the edges of fear returning, a fear I only ever felt in dreams, not in daylight. Something happened that night. Something my mind had never fully let me revisit. I rested my elbows on the table and lowered my head into my hands. The quiet around me thickened, turning the air heavy. When I lifted my head again, the memory shifted, deepened. I saw the yard covered in snow, clean except for 2 sets of footprints leading toward the shed. One larger. One smaller. My father's voice drifted through the image, low and tense, though I couldn't make out the words. I tried to listen harder, but sound doesn't travel well through memory. Only tone. Behind him, the silhouette stood with its head tilted slightly, like it was studying the house, or studying me. I felt my 8-year-old self retreat into the corner of the doorway, hiding behind the frame, watching their shapes blur together in the wind. My heart pounded so hard I could almost hear it. The cold rushed through the open door again, hitting my face in the memory and hitting my chest in the present. I inhaled sharply. Why had I forgotten all this? Or had I chosen to forget? Maybe I hid the notebook page because I was afraid of what it meant. Maybe my father tucked it into his coat because he knew something was coming. Or maybe my mother found it and tried to shield me from truths too heavy for a child. But one thing became painfully clear. I hadn't just witnessed something. I had recorded it. And a child's handwriting never lies. The kitchen dimmed as the last daylight slipped behind the hill. Shadows climbed the walls like they were remembering their own paths through the house. I pushed the note toward the center of the table and sat in the silence, letting the memory settle, not fully formed, not fully gone, but finally acknowledged. Snow. Shouting. Footprints. A figure I couldn't name. And me, standing in the doorway clutching a notebook like it held all the answers. The house creaked softly, almost like a reminder. I closed my eyes and whispered to the empty room, barely louder than the flicker of the kitchen light. What did I see that night, and why did the memory know how to hide from me? The wind was barely moving that morning, yet the trees behind Mr. Rourke's house shivered like something had brushed past them. I stood at the edge of his porch, listening to the soft tap of a loose gutter swinging in the breeze. It sounded nervous. Funny how a house can tell you things before a person ever does. I raised my hand to knock, but for a moment I just watched my reflection in the fogged glass, older, tired, carrying questions I didn't know how to shape into words. When I finally knocked, the sound felt too loud for that quiet street, like it might wake something neither of us wanted to remember. Mr. Rourke had lived next door longer than I'd been alive. Even when I was a child, he'd move slow, as if time didn't chase him the way it chased everyone else. But when he opened the door that morning, something in his shoulders looked sharper, almost startled. "Morning, son," he murmured, stepping back to let me in. The house smelled like old coffee and dust that hadn't settled right. Curtains hung half open, letting in strips of gray light that cut across the floor like forgotten paths. We sat at his kitchen table, the same one I'd eaten peach cobbler at when I was 9. The wood was scratched now, worn through in spots where elbows had rested too long. He didn't ask why I'd come. Maybe he already knew. Maybe everyone on that street knew something except me. I rested my hands on the table, palms cold. "I've been going through some of my mother's things," I said softly. "Trying to understand that winter." His eyes flicked toward the field outside his window, the field that had separated our houses for decades. The field where the snow always fell heavier. Where silence held on too long. The air in the room tightened, just a little. Enough for me to feel it settling between us. He reached for his mug, though it was empty. His fingers trembled before he pulled his hand back. "What do you want to know?" he asked, his voice thin but steady enough to pretend. I watched him for a moment. The way he didn't look directly at me. The way his throat worked when he swallowed. "That night," I said. "The night my father disappeared." His shoulders stiffened the second the words left my mouth. Like a thread had been pulled too tight. He didn't speak. Didn't breathe loud enough for me to hear it. I tried again, gentler. "You were home. Weren't you?" He nodded slowly. His eyes traveled again to the field, lingering there like the answer lived somewhere in the frostbitten grass. "Did you see anything?" The question hung there. Between the ticking clock and the faraway hum of a passing truck. He shifted in his chair. A sound escaped him, a small, broken exhale. "I don't." He cleared his throat. "I don't know anything about that night." But the tremble in his voice betrayed him. His words were a fence, but a poorly built one. I leaned back, not pushing further. Sometimes silence tells you more than a confession ever will. Before I stood up, I let my hand brush the old wooden table. It felt colder than it should have. As I walked toward the door, Mr. Rourke followed behind me, his steps slower than before. Almost hesitant. Almost scared. When I reached for the doorknob, he spoke, his voice low, like he was afraid the walls might overhear. "Some things," he whispered, "your mama kept buried for a reason." I froze. He stood a few feet behind me, his hands shaking at his sides. Not with age. With memory. He wouldn't meet my eyes. What reason? I asked, barely above a breath. He shook his head. Not a firm no. Just a quiet surrender. I shouldn't have said that, he murmured, voice fraying. Lord knows I shouldn't have said anything. The wind outside pushed against the house, rattling a loose shutter. The sound made him flinch. I took a step toward him. Mr. Rourke, was she protecting me? His jaw tightened. For a moment I thought he might finally tell me the thing he'd been holding for years. But instead he turned away, looking out through the narrow slit between the curtains. Toward the field. Toward whatever memory had carved fear into his bones. You go on now, he said quietly. Before you start digging in ground that don't want to be disturbed. Digging. The word settled heavy inside me. Like it belonged to something older, deeper, something I wasn't meant to touch. I stepped off his porch slowly, the boards creaking under my feet like they recognized me. The sky had darkened while we talked, clouds gathering over the field in thick, heavy folds. Behind me, I heard the soft click of Mr. Rourke locking his door. Not once. Twice. I looked toward the field, the same place his eyes had kept drifting. Cold wind slipped through the grass, bending it in one long, shivering wave. My mother had kept secrets. That much was clear now. But it wasn't fear that settled in my chest as I walked home. It was a question. Quiet, heavy, and sharp around the edges. Was she protecting me from the truth? Or protecting the truth from me? And why did the field suddenly feel like it knew the answer? Dawn hadn't fully broken yet. The sky was still holding on to its last bit of night, a thin blue-gray band stretching over the field. But something in the earth was already awake. I stepped onto the grass, feeling the cold reach through the soles of my shoes. A faint mist curled low to the ground, moving slowly, like it was following something I couldn't see. Then I noticed them, shallow impressions in the soil, forming a quiet trail across the field. Not deep enough to belong to a grown man. Not scattered like footprints from wandering animals. Just deliberate. And leading straight toward the old shed by the fence line. The field was different in the early morning. Less forgiving. More honest. When the sun hadn't yet warmed the world, the ground held every mark a little longer. As if time moved slower here. I followed the impressions carefully, listening to the soft crunch of frost beneath my feet. The air tasted metallic, like rain that never fully arrived. My mother used to warn me about the field. Said it swallowed things. Said it held onto stories that weren't meant to be told. But I walked anyway. The footprints led me toward the shed, an old wooden structure leaning slightly to the left, the door hanging crooked on its rusted hinges. I hadn't been inside since I was a boy. Back when my father kept tools hanging neatly along the walls, everything smelling of fresh-cut wood and oil. Now the boards were weathered. Nails protruded like old bones. And the padlock that used to keep it shut was missing. Leaving the door half open, as though someone had slipped in quietly. I reached out and touched the edge of the door. It was damp. Cold. Almost breathing. Behind me, the field stayed silent. Waiting. I nudged the door open with my shoulder. The smell hit me first, earthy, wet, like soil that had been turned over too recently. A faint drip echoed somewhere inside, though I couldn't see water. My eyes adjusted slowly. The shelves were dusty. The walls bare. But the floor looked disturbed, patches of loose dirt scattered around as if someone had been digging or searching. The footprints ended here, right at the entrance. I stepped inside, each footfall stirring up the smell of mold and something older, something that had been sleeping too long. A stack of rotting boards leaned against the back wall. One corner lifted slightly, as if someone had moved them and placed them back in a hurry. I crouched, fingers hovering over the wood before lifting one piece away. It groaned softly, splinters breaking like brittle whispers. Underneath, a small metal tin sat half buried in the dirt. Its lid rusted. Its body dented. But unmistakably out of place. I brushed away the soil with the back of my hand. My breath caught when I saw the initials scratched faintly along the top. My initials. The ones my mother taught me to write. I swallowed, my throat tightening. Whatever was inside that box wasn't meant to stay buried. I opened the tin slowly. The hinge gave a soft metallic sigh, as if relieved to be used again. Inside were folded scraps of paper, torn edges, faded lines. Pages ripped from a notebook. My notebook! My hands trembled as I lifted the first piece. Even before I unfolded it, I recognized the childish handwriting, the clumsy loops of letters. I read the first line under my breath. There was a shadow by my window tonight. It moved like it knew me. My stomach knotted. The next page was worse. Someone whispered my name. They said it soft, like Mama does, but it wasn't Mama. I stared at the words, my own words, written years ago and hidden away like contraband. Why would someone tear these out? Why hide them? Why bury them in a shed instead of keeping them in the drawer with my other memories? A faint chill pressed against my back, like air shifting behind me. I turned, but the shed was empty. Still, it felt watched. I dug deeper inside the tin, pulling out the last page. The handwriting grew shakier. I think I saw Daddy outside. But his face wasn't right. He didn't look at me. Or maybe he did, but not with his eyes. A slow, rising cold settled through my chest. These weren't dreams. Not the way I'd convinced myself all these years. These were things a child saw. Things a child tried to tell. And someone decided those memories needed to disappear. I stepped out of the shed carefully, the pages clutched against my chest the way I once held the whole notebook. The footprints in the soil were already fading as the sun began to warm the ground. Melting into the earth like whoever made them, had never been there at all. I looked toward the house, toward the window where I used to press my forehead against the glass on cold nights, searching the dark for shapes I couldn't name. Now I wondered if something had been watching me back. The wind moved through the field, brushing past me like a warning or a memory. I couldn't tell which. I tucked the pages inside my coat. Whoever hid them didn't want me to remember. But now I couldn't forget. Not anymore. The coat lay across the kitchen table like a body someone had forgotten to bury properly. Morning light slid through the window, catching the dirt still clinging to its sleeves, turning each grain into something sharper than it should have been. I hadn't meant to touch it again. But my fingers kept drifting toward the fabric, tracing the familiar weight of it. The way children reach for a doorway they once ran through. Something felt wrong, heavier than before. As if the coat wasn't finished speaking. I lifted it gently, and a faint stiffness along one side made me pause. That's when I noticed the seam. Carefully stitched. Quietly hidden. I pulled my chair closer to the table and sat down, the coat spread out like a map of an old life I hadn't walked through in years. The thread along the seam didn't match the rest, thinner, newer, almost trembling. My mother had been good with her hands, she could patch a tear before it ever truly opened. But this wasn't her work. The stitches were uneven, rushed, as though someone had sewn it shut in the dark, using only the feel of the fabric to guide them. The house around me felt unusually still. Pots resting on shelves. The old clock ticking only every other second. Even the refrigerator hum seemed to fade, leaving me alone with the sound of my own breath. I picked up a small pair of scissors from the drawer. The metal felt cold, too cold for the room. For a long moment, I just held them. The memory of my father flashed in short, broken pieces, his laugh, the scratch of his beard when he hugged me, the stern way he said my name when he wanted me to listen. None of those pieces felt sharp enough to explain this hidden seam. The coat smelled faintly of winter. Or maybe I imagined that. Either way, something inside it wanted to be found. I slipped the scissors under the first stitch. The fabric resisted. Just barely, as if it remembered why it had been sealed. The thread snapped with a soft, breath-like sound. One by one, I cut through each stitch, watching them curl and fall like tiny broken legs onto the table. When I finally opened the seam, a small wooden shape slid out and dropped onto the table with a quiet thud. My breath caught. It was a toy. Worn smooth. Edges rounded from years of little hands holding it too tightly. I recognized it before my mind could even form the memory. A wooden horse. Carved on my 8th birthday. My father's hands guiding mine as the knife skimmed along the grain. He told me to carve gently. Said would remembered every intention. I picked it up with shaking fingers. A dark stain clung to one side, dried, brittle, something that shouldn't have been there. Something that hadn't always been there. My chest tightened. My heart moved slower, pushing the memory up like it had been trapped beneath ice. The last time I saw that toy, it wasn't on a table. It wasn't hidden in a coat. It was in his hand. The night he disappeared. The memory rose fully now, no longer a blur. I was standing in the hallway, barefoot. The house had been colder than usual, the kind of cold that crawled up the walls and seeped into the floorboards. My father knelt beside me, his face half-shadowed by the kitchen light behind him. He smelled like outside, frost and pine and something tired. He pressed the wooden horse into my palm. "Stay inside," he whispered. "No matter what you hear." I remembered the way his voice broke a little, like the words were too heavy for him to say. I remembered wanting to ask where he was going. Why he wouldn't take his coat. But he didn't wait for questions. He stood, gave me a look I didn't understand then, and walked toward the back door. The next sound I heard was the wind hitting the house. Then a shout, not angry, not frightened, just sharp, like a warning. Then footsteps in the yard. More than one. And then silence. A long stretch of silence that lasted through the night. And through the years. My hands shook now as the memory settled, no longer hiding. Why had the toy been sealed into his coat? Why stitched shut, like a message meant only for someone who already knew too much? Who hid it? And what were they trying to say? I placed the toy gently on the table, facing me. Its wooden eyes seemed darker than I remembered, like they'd been carrying the night he vanished all this time. Outside, the wind brushed against the house, the same way it did the night I forgot almost everything. I stared at the coat, the torn seam now gaping like a wound that had waited too long to be cleaned. My father's final words echoed softly in the kitchen, slipping through the silence like a breath I couldn't release. "Stay inside, no matter what you hear." I wasn't a child anymore. But the warning still felt alive. And whatever I had heard that night, whatever I had buried, was beginning to rise again. The house felt colder than it should have that night, as if winter had settled into the walls long before the season arrived. I sat at the kitchen table again, the wooden horse resting beside my hand, its shadow stretching toward me like it remembered something I didn't. A faint sound drifted through the house, not the wind, not the ticking clock, something softer. Almost like two voices trailing across a memory I'd buried too deep. I closed my eyes, and the cold shifted. It thickened. It sharpened. And suddenly, I was back in that winter. The one with the argument I was never meant to hear. It always began the same way, with the sound of my mother's voice lowering, then breaking off. Not angry. Not loud. Just tight, like she was holding something between her teeth to keep it from falling out. I remembered sitting on the bottom step of the staircase, my knees pulled to my chest, pretending to play with the fringe on the carpet so it would look like I wasn't listening. Through the kitchen doorway, my parents stood close together, too close for their words to feel safe. My mother kept glancing at the window. My father kept shaking his head. Every few sentences, they'd pause, not because they were done speaking, but because they were choosing what not to say around me. Their voices weren't the same. Hers had an edge of warning. His sounded tired, like he'd already lost an argument somewhere far away and couldn't bear to lose another one at home. The air in the house felt heavy that night. Cold seeped up from the floors, filling the spaces between their words. At 8 years old, I didn't know what fear looked like in adults. Not yet. But I knew what it felt like. And that winter night breathed it into the walls. I remembered slipping out the back door when their voices grew too soft to follow, the way children wander toward trouble without knowing that's where they're headed. Snow covered the yard in a thin, glassy layer. The moon hung low, the kind that makes every shadow look taller than it should. I held my notebook against my chest, the one with uneven lines and half-finished drawings. Back then, I wrote down everything I didn't understand. Maybe I thought writing it would make it make sense. As I stepped into the yard, the wind caught the porch door and made it creak. I froze. Not because of the cold, but because I wasn't alone out there. 2 figures stood near the tool shed. One was my father. The other. I still struggled to describe him. His face was hidden by the hood of a heavy coat. He stood taller than my father, shoulders tense, like every muscle in him was working to contain something. Their voices were quiet but sharp, cutting into the cold. My father's hands kept rising, palms open, pleading or warning, I couldn't tell. The stranger leaned closer, and I saw my father take a small step back. At the time, I didn't understand fear. But I recognized it that night, standing in the snow with my breath turning to smoke around me. It wasn't mine. It was his. I remembered slipping out the back door when their voices grew too soft to follow, the way children wander toward trouble without knowing that's where they're headed. Snow covered the yard in a thin, glassy layer. The moon hung low, the kind that makes every shadow look taller than it should. I held my notebook against my chest, the one with uneven lines and half-finished drawings. Back then, I wrote down everything I didn't understand. Maybe I thought writing it would make it make sense. As I stepped into the yard, the wind caught the porch door and made it creak. I froze. Not because of the cold, but because I wasn't alone out there. 2 figures stood near the tool shed. One was my father. The other. I still struggled to describe him. His face was hidden by the hood of a heavy coat. He stood taller than my father, shoulders tense, like every muscle in him was working to contain something. Their voices were quiet but sharp, cutting into the cold. My father's hands kept rising, palms open, pleading or warning, I couldn't tell. The stranger leaned closer, and I saw my father take a small step back. At the time, I didn't understand fear. But I recognized it that night, standing in the snow with my breath turning to smoke around me. It wasn't mine. It was his. Back at the kitchen table, my hands were trembling. Not from cold, but from the sudden weight of remembering. 2 voices. 2 figures. 2 truths breathing in the winter dark. I looked at the wooden horse again, its stained side catching the morning light just enough to glint like something alive. My father hadn't been alone that night. Someone else had been there. Close enough to touch him. Close enough to threaten him. And I had written something down back then, in that notebook I clutched against my chest, something important enough that someone hid the pages away. Someone who didn't want me remembering. But memory has its own winter. Its own thaw. And mine was finally beginning. The town was quiet in the early afternoon, the kind of quiet that feels deliberate, like it's holding its breath. I walked past the faded storefronts, the cracked sidewalks crunching softly beneath my shoes. A wind stirred up dust in the alleyways, carrying a scent of old leaves and wet concrete. I paused outside Mrs. Callahan's shop, her windows fogged from years of cooking and winter fires. She was inside, hunched over her counter, hands folded. I felt the same hush settle over me I remembered from the field that night. The kind that whispers, some things want to remain unseen. I stepped inside. The bell above the door tinkled softly, barely disturbing the quiet that hung thick in the air. Mrs. Callahan looked up slowly, her eyes catching mine with that piercing clarity only age and memory can give. "Sit," she said, motioning to a chair that creaked under the weight of her memories. The room smelled of tea and old paper. Sunlight filtered through yellowed curtains, landing in sharp rectangles across the wooden floor. Everything felt suspended in a moment that hadn't moved in years. I explained why I'd come, my voice small against the walls lined with dusty jars and faded photographs. She nodded, as though she'd been expecting this. Her fingers laced together, tightening then loosening, a rhythm I couldn't name but recognized as worry. And then she spoke. Winter of '87. I remember because it was colder than most. People were quiet. Something unsettled the town. Her voice trembled only slightly. Not from age. From memory. From something she hadn't wanted to say aloud until now. The kind of tremble that carries pieces of truth you can't forget once you hear them. She described him slowly. A drifter who'd come to the outskirts of town, lingering near empty barns and abandoned lots. The kind who asks too many questions and doesn't answer politely. Who leaves notes, glances, and unease wherever he goes. I saw him once, she said, voice dropping. Standing near the field, talking to your father. I didn't know who he was. No one did. He left the same week your father disappeared. I froze. The silhouette she described matched the stranger from my memory. The one I had seen that winter night, framed by moonlight near the shed, shoulders tense, voice low and urgent. My hands gripped the edge of the chair. The air felt thinner, like it had been waiting for me to notice. Mrs. Callahan's eyes were steady now, scanning mine, trying to make me see what she'd seen too. He didn't belong here, she continued. Not really. But he knew things. Too much. A shiver ran through me. If the man had returned that night, what had he wanted from my father? And why did it feel like every answer I'd held onto for years was suddenly dangling just out of reach? The past pressed against me, cold and insistent. She leaned closer, lowering her voice to a whisper I could barely hear over the sound of the wind outside. Some people think they can pass through a town and leave no mark. But he did. He left shadows where they didn't belong. I pictured the field again. The way the snow had held the footprints. The way my father had flinched under the stranger's gaze. The way the wind had carried voices I couldn't understand. Mrs. Callahan took a deep breath and set her hand on mine. You're lucky you remember anything at all. Most kids forget. Most adults want to forget. Her words hit like a quiet hammer. I had remembered. Not all. Not perfectly. But enough. The stranger's return wasn't about the town. Not entirely. It had been about my father. Or maybe about me. I couldn't tell yet which. But now I knew the man's presence had been deliberate. And the weight of knowing that someone had come back. Someone I'd almost forgotten. Settled into my chest, heavy, cold, and real. I left the chair slowly, heart tight, ears straining for any sound beyond her quiet breaths. Outside, the town was still quiet, but I felt it differently. Every corner of the street seemed to hold a shadow of that winter. Every alleyway a pause. The stranger had existed. He had returned. And he had left marks no one could erase. I glanced toward the horizon, toward the field beyond the fences. The sun was inching higher, but the light couldn't reach everything. Something stayed in shadow, no matter how bright it got. I walked away slowly, my notebook pressed to my chest. The past was no longer a blur. It had shapes. Edges. Footprints in the snow that demanded to be followed. and I knew I had to follow them. The winter of two voices hadn't ended. It was only beginning. The field stretched wide beneath the gray dawn, every stalk of dried grass bowing under the weight of frost. I stood alone, boots sinking slightly in the cold, and let the silence settle over me like a second skin. The shovel from weeks ago lay discarded at the edge of the earth, its handle worn smooth by my grip. I thought of the coat, the notebook pages, the toy stained with darkness, and the shadowed figure my father had faced. For the first time, it felt like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to see what had always been in plain sight. I pieced it together slowly, like fitting jagged shards into a whole I didn't know existed. The notes from my childhood, the torn pages hidden in tin, in coat seams, weren't random. They were warnings. Clues. Reminders of a story I wasn't old enough to understand at the time. The toy, carved by my father on my 8th birthday, its dark stain now clear in my mind, wasn't evidence of cruelty. It was a signal. A promise. I remembered his words that night, quiet but firm, stay inside. No matter what you hear. Not instructions for a game. Not the caution of a nervous parent. Protection. And the coat, buried and stitched, wasn't abandonment. It was secrecy. A safeguard. I thought of my mother's locked drawer, the photos, the fragments of notebook hidden behind receipts and old recipes. Her silence had been deliberate. A shield. Her love had created a quiet bubble around me, keeping me intact while the storm raged elsewhere. Standing there, the cold nipping at my hands, I felt the weight of every choice my parents had made. Every omission, every hidden note, every buried memory. I wasn't just uncovering the past. I was uncovering the care they had hidden inside it. I traced the footprints in the frost toward the shed, letting my eyes sweep over the field as if it might confess its secrets. The hollow smell of damp earth reminded me of the tin under the rotting boards. The small notebook pages with childish handwriting trembled in my mind, whispering of shadows, of voices calling my name in the dark. And then it clicked. The stranger hadn't come for my father because of him. He had come for me. All the careful hiding, all the buried toys and sewn seams, the final whispered instructions, they were measures to keep me safe. My father's disappearance wasn't a retreat. It was a barricade. I sank to my knees, letting my hand brush against the frost-coated grass. The field that had felt empty for so long suddenly carried weight. Every stalk, every depression in the soil was a witness. Every faint footprint a story my father left behind. And for the first time, I understood the bravery it had taken for him to leave, for him to instruct my mother to shield me, and for her to obey. But even with clarity, a question gnawed at me. The stranger. Why had he returned? What had he wanted with us, with me? I could see my father in the moonlight again, tense and frightened, holding the toy, holding me in his absence. I could almost hear his breath, almost hear his heart. The realization came with a quiet ache. I had spent years fearing abandonment. Years wondering if my father had left because of weakness, fear, or some failing I might have caused. None of it was true. He had left because he loved me fiercely. Because he had known, even as a man unsure and afraid, that the world held dangers my 8-year-old self could not yet face. The coat, the toy, the notes, my mother's silence, they were all strands in a net woven around me. Protection disguised as mystery. Love disguised as absence. I felt the air tighten around me as if the field itself had absorbed my realization. The weight of the truth pressed into my chest, heavier than frost or fear. And then the question returned, sharper. The stranger. Why had he wanted my family? What had he been after that demanded such lengths of secrecy and sacrifice? I traced the edges of the buried coat in my mind, the shape of the wooden toy, the fragments of my notebook. The answer wasn't here. It was out there. It was someone else's story, intersecting with ours in ways I was only beginning to see. The clarity brought no relief. Only the sharp, cold understanding that protection and danger had always existed side by side. and that sometimes love meant leaving someone unseen in order to keep them safe. I rose to my feet, boots crunching in frost. The field felt endless, holding every secret and every unspoken truth I'd just begun to unravel. The sky brightened with winter light, but the shadows lingered, clinging to the edges of every stalk of grass, every footprint frozen in soil. The coat, the toy, the notes, each piece a testament to my father's love and his fear. I exhaled, letting the cold fill my lungs, feeling the weight of everything I never knew. And yet, the stranger's question, the reason he came, still hovered in the air, unanswered. It wasn't over. Not yet. The field waited, patient and silent. So did I. Because some truths can't be unearthed all at once. They come slowly. And when they do, they demand to be faced. The sky had bruised into shades of violet and charcoal as I stepped into the field. The air smelled faintly of damp earth, of frost melting into the night. Each step pressed the soles of my boots into soil that felt almost alive beneath me, soft where it shouldn't be. The wind whispered through the dry stalks, carrying a faint memory I couldn't place at first. I held the shovel in both hands, its handle cold and familiar, like an old promise. Somewhere beneath the ground, the last piece of a story waited. A story I had chased through shadows and silence, through torn pages and buried toys, through the long absence of my father. The field was quiet in the way that only a place haunted by memory can be. I knelt where the earth gave under my fingers, listening to the faint crunch of frost breaking. The light fell in thin slices, painting long shadows across the ground, and for a moment it felt like I was not alone. Every past chapter rose in fragments, the buried coat, the stained toy, the torn notebook pages tucked away in tin and seams. Every fragment a breadcrumb left by my parents, leading me here. I thought of my father's words again, long ago, whispered across a winter night. Stay inside. No matter what you hear. I had never understood fully. Not then. And my mother, her locked drawers, her quiet, protective silence, suddenly made sense in a way it hadn't before. She had carried the weight of the truth alone, keeping me safe in ignorance. The depth of that care pressed against my chest, heavy and impossible to shrug off. Now, standing in the field, holding the shovel, I felt the fragile thread between knowledge and pain. I could finally see it all, and I feared what seeing it might cost me. I dug where the soil felt softest, each turn of the blade sending a shiver through the quiet evening. The earth gave way reluctantly at first, then more willingly, as if it had been waiting decades for this moment. Roots tangled around the shovel, clinging to secrets they had held too long. Finally, the metal edge struck something thin but firm. I pulled it free, brushing layers of dirt from a folded page of my notebook. The handwriting was small, jagged, my own from a time when the world was larger and my voice smaller. The words etched across the page made my stomach drop. The stranger had come for me. He had demanded something from my father, threatening to take me away if what was owed was not given. And in those hurried, childlike scrawls, I saw fear I had buried for years. I pressed the page to my chest, closing my eyes. I could feel my father's presence, his fight against that man, the courage it must have taken to stand between me and danger. For the first time, the silence of my father's absence felt intentional, filled with protection instead of mystery. The ground, the air, the fading light, all seemed to tremble with the weight of this revelation. I knelt in the hollow where the page had rested, letting the wind carry away my shallow breaths. I saw the outline of the night my father faced the stranger, framed in moonlight and shadows. A man demanding, my father refusing, and a child hidden, notebook clutched, heart hammering. It hit me with quiet force, my father had fought. He had stood his ground, and that fight had been why he never returned. Not cowardice, not escape, but sacrifice. He had given everything to keep me alive, even his own life. I let the page fall to the soil, tracing its edges with a finger, feeling the imprint of words I had forgotten. The wind whispered again, brushing across the field like fingertips on skin, like memory breathing. The truth was finally unearthed. And yet it was heavier than I had imagined. Relief and grief collided in equal measure, a bittersweet tide I had no strength to resist. I whispered his name, softly, into the cold evening. "Thank you," I said, though I wasn't sure if he could hear me. And then the question returned, quiet and insistent. Now that I knew, could I forgive the years of silence, the absence, the mystery? Could knowing bring peace, or would it open a wound that would never close? I rose slowly, boots sinking slightly in the soil, carrying the weight of truth like a cloak around my shoulders. The field seemed empty again, but I knew it held every fragment of my past, every hidden moment, every act of courage I had never understood. The sky darkened into indigo, and stars appeared like scattered eyes watching me. I folded the notebook page carefully, placing it in my pocket. A promise formed quietly in my chest, unspoken but resolute, to carry the memory of my father with care, to honor his sacrifice, and to live in the shadow of his love rather than the absence. The wind moved through the stalks again, and for a moment, it felt as though the field exhaled, as though the earth itself had released a long-held secret. I left the soil behind, boots crunching, heart still heavy, whispering to the cold night. I'll remember. I'll keep it safe. Some truths cannot be buried forever. Some shadows only fade when faced.